I'm Mark Blattner, the CEO of the Jewish Federation of
Mark, of course, sure.
Greater Portland, and we're honored today to have United States Senator from Oregon, Senator Ron Wyden. He's been our senator from here since January of 1996. He's a ranking member of the Finance Committee. He also serves on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the Budget Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, the Joint Committee on Taxation, and is a true friend to the Jewish community and part of the Mishpacha. And we really want to make the most of this time to let you say a few words. And then Bob Hornstein will monitor a Q&A, and we invite everybody to please, on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A section to add any questions you would like. So Senator, we'll turn it to you.
Mark, thanks so much. And it's great to have a chance to be with you. I was also the minion maker in the United States Senate, and I'm especially glad to be with friends because it's been a exasperating day. My bipartisan amendment got 59 votes about an hour or so ago to prohibit the government, particularly Bill Barr, for conducting warrantless searches into your web searches and internet browsing and the like without getting a warrant. And it just seems to me, with millions of Americans, hundreds of thousands of Oregonians being home right now in the middle of a pandemic and being online from the moment they wake up in the morning till the moment they go to bed, they ought to have some measure of privacy. And we got a big vote, 59 votes, but you needed 60. So we're back trying to figure out what's ahead with the next vote. We're dealing with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act legislation, an important bill, and that's what the next vote will be. So it's great to talk with some friends, and why don't I just spare the filibuster and just let folks in the community talk about what's important to them.
So thank you, Senator, and we're looking forward to having this chat with you. Let's start out. The JCRC had a conversation with Senator Steiner Hayward, and she mentioned that that Oregon is looking at the possibility of a $2 to $3 billion state deficit. We know the House is set to vote on a package, which, according to rumors at least, could be dead on arrival in the Senate in terms of getting more aid out to the states to help with their deficits. So what's your view about that? What are the chances that we're going to see something that will help states and municipalities with this huge deficit problem that they're facing?
Well, I feel very strongly that there needs to be a generous package to help the states and localities. And in effect, over here in the Senate, Mitch McConnell got off to a pretty ominous start right at the beginning of the debate when he said, well, it would be fine with him if states and localities just went bankrupt, and tried to pin it all on pension issues and the like. I mean, the fact is, in Oregon, our police and our fire and our emergency responders, when I talk to the rural counties, for example, they are seeing unprecedented demands on help for emergency responders. So I'm going to be doing everything I can, Bob, to get the most generous funding we can, and to ensure that it also gives our local government officials and Governor Brown a lot of flexibility, because the combination of additional dollars plus additional flexibility is what we very much need for police, fire, emergency responders, and essential services.
Okay, that's good. Good to hear. Thank you. One of the concerns after the debacle in Wisconsin and the concern about whether people in November will actually be able to vote in person, for example, is free, fair, and accessible elections. I know that some of the advocacy groups are asking for as much as $4 billion to support elections in the states. What do you think about what's going to happen, and how can Congress make sure that we have fair elections in November?
Bob, I have led the Senate in terms of promoting vote by mail with Senator Klobuchar. I'll just kind of walk folks through this. I was the first United States senator to ever get elected in an all mail-in election. And then in 2002, it was the very first bill, first ever proposed in the Congress, to make it possible for everyone in America to vote by mail. I said we ought to really pick up on the Oregon model. Back then, it was kind of an academic debate. Lots of professors, I called it the tweed jacket set, were writing articles on various issues about how it would work, who it might favor, this sort of thing. All that has changed, and very dramatically, because now it is no longer an academic issue. It is a fundamental public safety question. And what I have done in leading the Senate on this issue with Senator Klobuchar is say, I believe we need to COVID-proof our elections this fall. We ought to be using the Oregon model rather than that garish spectacle that we saw in Wisconsin just a few weeks ago. I think the country is finally headed our way. Bright red Kansas, for example, a week ago voted all by mail in their primary. Republican local officials, people like Larry Hogan of Maryland, Mike DeWine of Ohio, are beginning to break from Mitch McConnell. Apparently, the Pelosi package will be very generous in terms of funding. The figure that's being offered seems to be generally over $3.5 billion. Senator Klobuchar and I have pushed for the generous funding in the Senate, and we're going to pull out all the stops. And I've probably done 3 or 4 events a week just in the last week, Common Cause, Electronic Frontier Foundation, a variety of others, because I think that this is our best opportunity to give people a chance to vote without threatening their health.
So a related question, well, we've been hearing discussion about the post office possibly running out of funds. Do you think these bills will include support for the U.S. Postal Service?
We're going to have generous funding for the Postal Service in the Senate bill. Now, of course, Donald Trump would love to suffocate the Postal Service. He'd love to privatize it. And in doing so, he can use that as a way to derail vote by mail. Now, of course, there is the real chutzpah aspect of this. Donald Trump always talks about how horrible vote by mail is, but he uses it himself from Palm Beach, where he votes by mail. And actually, what I've done, it's on my Twitter feed, it's my pinned tweet. On my Twitter feed, I've actually done an example of how we vote by mail in Oregon. And I send a not so subtle message to Donald Trump by saying, Mr. President, you can see me sitting in my dining room. There are not thousands and thousands and thousands of people, as he has suggested, all over my living room and dining room, basically tampering with ballots.
So we have a question from David Fuchs, the former CEO of Cedars-Sinai Park. A number of nonprofits have been able to access the payroll loan program, which provides for debt forgiveness if used to maintain employment for their workers. I've been hearing about regulatory changes that might change this opportunity. How can we reassure the nonprofits?
Well, I feel very strongly about supporting those nonprofits as the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee. I've worked with David and others on the charitable laws, and obviously with PPP. So if anything, we're going to do what we can to expand opportunities for charities in the coronavirus 4 package, not constrain them.
Great. So a lot of the national conversation, as you know, is about testing. What is your view about states' testing capacity? Do you think that some states have reopened too soon? Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think that, first of all, for purposes of testing, we need a national blueprint. And the Trump administration has been kind of all over the map. Sometimes they say they've got it solved. You know, a couple of days ago, the president basically did a mission accomplished. You know, we're doing so much, testing, even though per capita it didn't stack up with with others. I think that we need the federal government to be a better and smarter partner with the states and localities in terms of testing at a minimum. For example, the last time I was home, and it's now been a number of weeks, I've been sitting at this desk in Dirksen Building in Washington, D.C. Essentially, the only break I had is I zoomed into a couple of Passover Seders. I was finding healthcare providers in Oregon who said, we can do the testing if the federal government will just help us get the reagent chemicals. So I think we still got a lot to do, and particularly a lot of our small healthcare programs, and particularly in rural communities, really are having problems getting the testing materials they need.
So a lot of folks, unfortunately, have had to apply for unemployment. The numbers are just astronomical. The Oregon unemployment compensation system, according to this one questioner, is broken and overwhelmed for sure. Tens of thousands of people are still waiting on their checks. How might Congress be able to help the system work better now?
Let me make sure the community understands how this all unfolded. I put together the unemployment agreement a few doors down from where I'm sitting in the Senate Finance Room, and I did it with Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury. I said that we had to have 100% wage replacement, and we had to supercharge unemployment. We had to cover gig workers, the self-employed, the independent contractors, and the like. And what happened was Eugene Scalia, son of the late judge, basically just stonewalled. He refused to do anything to really be constructive in terms of dealing with the administration of the program, which is done by the states. It's done by Oregon, it's done by Rhode Island, it's done by Florida. I wish that I could just wave my wand and make it all go away, because there's been enormous frustration in Oregon, in so many states. As of a couple of days ago, 20 states hadn't even taken the new pandemic benefits, the gig workers and the independent contractors. And the press asked me what should be done. I said, Eugene Scalia ought to be on the phone every single day, telling those states he's available to help, he's available with additional resources. Now, 2 points. One, I was able to get the states $1 billion to start improving their outdated technological systems. Some of these systems are from the dark ages, COBOL programming. That's 60 years old. There are a lot of people following this who aren't 60 years old. I will tell people who are following the program that the checks and the $600 extra per week that I arranged with Secretary Mnuchin in the finance room last every week for 4 months, those are to be retroactive. So for folks that are having problems, they ought to be in contact with my office. Lisa Rockauer, of course, our state director, a member of the community and in good standing. And please feel free to call us. And I'm already beginning work on what we'll do after that benefit expires on July 31st. And I'm offering up what I call a trigger approach, which would really tie the benefits going forward to economic conditions on the ground. Wonderful.
So there's been talk from the administration about how we're going to pay for all this, and some of the talk is about cutting things like Medicare, Medicaid, even Social Security, SNAP. What can Congress do to make sure that these kinds of important, critical programs are not drastically cut?
Bob, as long as I'm the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, which is the committee with lead jurisdiction over those programs, anybody who's going to try to make the cuts in the safety net and vulnerable people and SNAP and the like, they're going to have to run over me. And I'll tell you, they're going to have a big fight on their hands. Incidentally, with respect to hunger, for those that are following it, I have proposed that Oregon set up a strategic food reserve. I wrote an op-ed piece on it in the Oregonian, and for those that would like to be involved, farmers and grocers and distributors and others, they ought to tell Lisa and the folks in the office, and we'll get them involved.
Okay, there's a lot of talk now, of course, about schools opening up. We know in Oregon that's not going to be the case, at least until the end of August, September. What are your thoughts about how can we open up schools and do it safely?
Well, Bob, I do feel that you start with the proposition that reopening the economy and the common sense health practices, whether it's social distancing, hand washing, all the various rules offered up by the CDC, you've got to intertwine them. They are interconnected. I mean, people ask about the economy. The reason I had to come together with the Trump administration and put together that unemployment package, supercharged unemployment, was because of the contagion that struck our country. It was the primary factor that produced the health wallop and the economic wallop that hurt Oregonians so much. So my sense will be, as we look to the schools, and the governor has a healthcare team around her, a good team. My hope is that they will be able to lift some of the more restrictive practices, particularly in the rural areas, when the safety judgment makes it clear that that can be done.
So getting back, we have another question about
apropos, Bob, one other point on that. I'm spending a lot of time on broadband issues apropos of kids and education to try to make sure that low-income kids have an internet connection.
Okay, just getting back to the topic of elections, there's a concerned questioner about could elections conceivably be postponed? That's not even possible, is it?
I don't believe it is lawful, but Jared Kushner apparently suggested that it was acceptable a couple days ago. Now he seems to have taken it back.
Well, that's good. So OSHA is supposed to protect workers. Why are they not able to force meat packing plants and similar food handling companies to keep workers from being forced to work when the conditions are clearly not safe?
Well, you're talking about OSHA, was that what you said?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
You heard me talk about Eugene Scalia. I just believe he's AWOL on these health and safety issues, whether it's meat packing facilities, whether it's paid sick leave, whether it's slow walking, unemployment issues. To give you an idea of his priorities, after I put together the agreement on the unemployment, the supercharging of benefits, one of Eugene Scalia's first stops was not out trying to tell everyone in America how this was a chance for workers to have money to pay for rent and groceries. One of his first stops was Fox Business, where he went to tell people he was very concerned about workers who are going to be getting these unemployment benefits to become dependent on government aid. That's about as heartless as I've heard in a long time. And also, I'm supportive of legislation to force OSHA to issue regulations on the food processing plants as well.
Okay, so we have some questions that are not COVID related. So for example, although there was apparently a judge ruling today, what was your opinion about the Justice Department dropping cases against Michael Flynn?
Well, I just think when you have a guy, who perjured, himself to just kind of fly out of nowhere and say, that's that, I think really chips away in a very fundamental fashion at the rule of law. I think it's very troubling.
For sure.
And it goes back to how I spent my time and the frustration of today falling one vote short. I'll tell you who really wants to use that warrantless surveillance of people's personal internet searches and browsing history is Bill Barr, the same fella who was up to his eyeballs in the Mike Flynn process.
A lot on the minds of us in the Jewish community is what's happening in the Middle East. And we know the Secretary of State just visited Israel for a very brief visit. The Trump administration rolled out their peace plan, or so-called peace plan, if you want to call it that. And what is your view about the plan? And a lot of us are now discussing the potential for an Israeli unilateral annexation of some parts to the West Bank. What are your feelings about that?
Well, let me do the West Bank, issue, because Bob and some in the community have heard me say this. I've been to the region a number of times, and there is immense suffering on the Israeli side. There's immense suffering on the Palestinian side. I mean, the bottom line is an Israeli mom is worried about putting her kid on a bus to go to a coffee shop because she's worried the child will get blown up on a bus. And a Palestinian mom has the same concern, the very same concern. So the suffering is immense. And I am through and through a committed advocate of a lasting two-state solution. I do not see any other rational path, to doing it. And I don't know of a Democratic senator who thinks that, the Israelis ought to move forward with unilateral annexation, if you want to know, if you're asking me my opinion about Democrats in the Senate. But what's really needed is to just focus like a laser on two-state solution. And I heard a rumor there was a presidential election coming up. Maybe we'll get ourselves a president who's for that.
Okay, but how do we get the Palestinians to re-engage?
Well, I think it is hunting and pecking always for the kinds of things that bring people back, to the table. And, good faith is met with good faith. I don't think that's what Jared Kushner ever was talking about. Jared Kushner was always talking about concessions on the part of one side and not the other. So I'd be the first to say that being a relentless advocate of a two-state solution is easier said than done. But I'll tell you, it's a hell of a lot better idea than the Trump people who are saying, who cares about a two-state solution? We want Jared Kushner's plan, which is all one-sided.
So Senator Wyden, we all love you very much. But we do not endorse. We don't endorse political candidates. But I will ask this question. There was a question, and we've seen this a couple times now, about when you're looking at the Democrats trying to regain control of the Senate. What particular races or states are you focusing on?
Well, I mean, for us, you can go sort of west to east. I mean, Mark Kelly in Arizona, the astronaut, wonderful man. John Hickenlooper in Colorado, a terrific guy. I'm a huge fan of Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, who I've worked with on forestry issues. You keep going eastward. Teresa Greenfield in Iowa, I think, is a really thoughtful leader. Susan Collins in Maine, I think, is somehow managing to convince people the only time she'll be moderate is when it doesn't count. And so we're very hopeful, and I don't know what the rules are, but those are the big races. And since you asked me, that's my take.
Okay. So getting
of
back
course, we adore Doug Jones in Alabama. It's a very tough race. He's a wonderful former civil rights lawyer and a very close personal friend of mine.
Getting back to COVID, since the executive branch doesn't appear to want to release the guidelines on testing and contact tracing, now supposedly they're being edited, there seems to be a void. Can Congress do anything to fill that void in terms of a national strategy?
Well, we constantly try to hold them accountable. Yesterday, for example, the hearing in what's called the HELP Committee, chaired by Lamar Alexander with Patty Murray as the ranking member, kept trying to get the Trumpers pinned down on that. I have really taken the lead on one of those kind of key measures, which is the number of deaths in nursing homes, where the deaths are taking place, and the incidence of serious illness, because serious illness, of course, is a key barometer of whether you'll have a outbreak. So that question was raised, and senators talked about my involvement in that. And again, as a ranking Democrat in the Finance Committee, we have jurisdiction over, for example, Medicaid, and Medicaid pays for something like 2/3 of the nursing home beds in America.
Someone wants to know, is anybody addressing climate change? We've seen, again, the impact of climate change, even with this virus. What's happening on the legislative level?
Well, let me tell everybody about a homegrown effort. A couple days ago, I unveiled a bill that I've been working on for a number of months. It's one of the reasons why I was sitting at this desk week after week, called the 21st Century Conservation Corps for better health and good jobs. And what it's designed to do is deal with what I think is going to be a very challenging summer for us, both from the standpoint of safety, the matter of breathable air, which is what you face when you're getting a fire season, and whole industries like our guides and outfitters really getting clobbered because they're not eligible for a lot of these programs like PPP and the like. And folks can read about my bill online. Some of the key parts are going in there and thinning out the 2.5 million acres of hazardous fuels. That, of course, is a magnet for fire, a major effort for watershed restoration. And we're also working with the Forest Service on something you never would have seen again. You know, the fire camps are kind of a bit of Oregon history, young people in those fire camps and doing a phenomenal amount of work and so courageous. Now we've got to figure out how to make sure that there's social distancing, and they're going to have MREs rather than the kind of old style cafeteria buffet kind of thing. It's going to be a lot of changes.
So as you know very well, this virus has exposed the inequities in society that have been a feature, unfortunately, of our society for a long time. We know that people of color are more vulnerable, especially African Americans, more vulnerable to the disease. We know that minority communities, not all of them have access to internet and therefore online classes. We know that certain minority businesses, African-American businesses, have not been able to avail themselves of the PPP loans. What can be done to address these inequities once and for all?
One of the best ways to pursue it is through my Algorithm Accountability Act with Yvette Clarke, the Congresswoman who's the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And what we have tried to do is say, you know, look, so many of these decisions as it relates to health and housing and basic, services really are made as a result of questions that aren't completely neutral. In other words, we put our values in them and they get incorporated in these algorithms. And the Congresswoman and I want full disclosure of that. I will also tell you that I'm trying to remake some of those programs for the most vulnerable, like TANF. And the Federation's been a huge supporter of TANF in the past. Temporary assistance for needy families. Well, you know, right now, a lot of those families are having to choose between whether they're going to eat or they're going to sit in the dark. Under my legislation, they'd have a chance to do it. It'll go to the Finance Committee, and I'm just being advised by the floor staff that I got to get over there to make this vote. And so I want to say this to the community. I so appreciate this friendship and these relationships. As Mark said, this is about Mishbruka. And I so wish I was home, wish I could have been home for the holidays this year. And what I'd like to do is just say thank you for all these wonderful friendships over the years. And let's put today's conversation in the to be continued department, okay?
Senator Wyden, thank you for all that you do for our country and for our state and for spending some time with us. We had a lot of other questions, but we'll have to do it some other time.
We'll do it again.
Take care.
And Ben and Jenny and my staff are staying on, okay?
Okay, so
Thanks.
let's try and let's ask some more questions. So we have Ben and Jenny, you can come on and unmute yourselves and we'll go through some of these other questions. If you can answer them, there's pressure on companies to send the government names of employees who refuse to return to work because of safety concerns. These employees may have their unemployment benefits stopped. Do you know what the senator or what Congress can do about that?
So, yeah, so I'm happy to take a stab at that.
And Jenny, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure.
And Ben can introduce himself as well.
Sure. So I'm Jenny Katzman, and I am Senator Wyden's Chief Counsel for Domestic Policy. Then I'll have my colleague Ben introduce himself too.
Yeah, hi, Ben Widness. I work on foreign affairs, defense, and national security issues.
So I'm happy to try to answer that question. I think one of the things that our boss was trying to say is that, that this has been a slow process, that we have to make sure that when we're reopening the economy, that we're doing so in a way that's very safe. Trying not to rush businesses to bring back employees until it's safe, especially non-essential workers, and when employees are brought back in, to make sure that they have the necessary PPE to keep them safe from COVID. Additionally, as the questioner probably knows, under unemployment insurance, in order to maintain unemployment insurance, you have to, continually be looking for a job, and you can't turn down your former job. I don't know what our boss's position is on turning over names, although he is quite the privacy hawk. So that is generally not something that he would favor. But I think even before getting to that point, is he's an advocate for making sure that when businesses reopen, that they're doing so in a manner that's timely, but mostly safe, or what entirely safe, but and doing so in a timely fashion.
So there's still a lot of questions about vote by mail, about the Postal Service. Only so many states right now have vote by mail. There are other measures that can be taken, such as no excuse absentee ballots, early voting. So you have maybe a week-long period so that people, if they're voting in person, they can actually be able to spread out and not have so many people like we saw the lines in Wisconsin. He talked a little bit about this, but do you think is there any effort in Congress to require these kinds of measures, let alone the senator talked about funding for states to enact these measures, but do you think there's any effort to actually require these measures in Congress, or do you think it's just right now, it's just with a divided House and Senate, it's just not going to happen?
Yeah, no, as Senator Wyden mentioned, he and Senator Klobuchar introduced a bill that focused on ensuring vote by mail for all states. It also had a component in there for early voting, as the questioner indicated too, with the idea that there are some states that are, not where Oregon is, and that there are some groups of voters in those states that might be better served or would like to have that as an additional option. So there is definitely an effort among Democrats to pass legislation that would mandate both mail-in voting. So for everybody who would want to, you could send a ballot to all eligible voters, but then also to have the option of an in-person early voting too, as you mentioned, to sort of spread out the voting times for voters in each state.
So Ben, I want to try to include you. There's a lot of, again, a lot of discussion around Iran. We know that they're being plagued, no pun intended, by this virus, yet they continue to cause instability in the region. There's talk about additional sanctions. There's talk about, eventually could the nuclear arms agreement with Iran be made stronger? Where is Senator Wyden? What's his thinking about how to make sure Iran becomes a player in the civilized international community and stops what are these proxies making life difficult for the countries around, but also for Israel. I mean, they're in Syria now. So what's happening on that front?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. It's a really good question. So, Ron has worked tirelessly to support round after round of crippling, biting sanctions on a bipartisan basis, which is the important point. The Trump administration, and I should say that the point of those sanctions was to force the Iranians to the negotiating table. And the result, as I think everybody knows, was the 2015 nuclear agreement. And, there were disagreements about how successful that final product was. But the Trump administration has really kind of thrown that out the window and not provided any sort of anything to fill the void, right? What you hear from the Trump administration constantly is maximum pressure, maximum pressure. But they haven't defined maximum pressure toward what end, right? Which makes it difficult. So, absent administration leadership, you have a kind of piecemeal approach in Congress, and you've been kind of unable to form a really sort of enduring bipartisan consensus around what comes next. And as a result, there really isn't anything. So Ron has tried to work with like-minded folks, but again, the administration's silence on this is harmful and deafening.
Okay, so unfortunately, there has been another uptick in the last year in anti-Semitic incidents. Some of those rise to the level of hate crimes. The ADL just came out with their report. We know that in the last couple of years, hate crimes directed at communities of faith, 60% of them are directed at the Jewish community, Jewish individuals or institutions. Now we're seeing, of course, cyber hate going through the roof and directed not just at Jews, of course, but Asian Americans, the immigrant community. What can Congress do to try and mitigate this problem?
Yeah. So, that touches a number of, I think, different portfolios. I can perhaps offer part of the answer. You're absolutely right on rising hate around the world. And Ron has signed on to a number of letters and bills that would, better coordinate with allied governments on pushing back against this when it happens. And he has also supported increased funding through the Department of Homeland Security for Jewish community centers and similar institutions in other faith communities to help them improve their security domestically. But I mean, one of the problems here is an administration that sometimes says the right things and then sometimes says things like there are good people on both sides. And so that kind of rhetoric, from our perspective, just what we're seeing does make this more difficult. But I mean, it's a huge problem. It's not just limited to Jewish communities, as you point out. And Ron has, since coming to Congress, tried to do everything he can to signal that hate is not something that ought to be tolerated, and that the government ought to use its resources to push back strongly against it.
So we had a question. This is really for the senator, but I'd be curious to know your observations. This is such a strange campaign year. We have the presumptive Democratic nominee who, can't campaign right now unless it's virtual. We know the president likes to do his rallies. He can't do those now. I mean, how do you see, from your, viewpoint there in DC, how do you see this campaign unfolding as the summer months and into the fall proceed?
Well, so there's a huge firewall, of course, between the work that Jenny and I do on a daily basis on behalf of Oregonians and on the campaign side. And so, honestly, it may sound odd to people, but we have no idea when, the senator is campaigning, and we can't. So, we could only begin to answer that question as, regular Americans. We've got, and from that, just speaking in my personal capacity, I mean, yeah, it's a really great question. I assume I'll find out along with 330 million Americans. I don't intend to duck the question. I don't have a better answer.
Sure. Jenny, did you want to say anything? You want to pass?
Yeah, I mean, it's the lawyer in me, and it's concerned about the ethics questions for us. Yeah, I mean, the same sort of thing. I mean, I see it playing out differently, but again, we don't have any special insight. The work that we do for Senator Wyden is very separate from the campaign work that he engages in, though he's not up the cycle, and that the senators that are running for re-election engage in.
Sure. So one of the concerns that a lot of folks have now is this you see this tension between the administration and the scientists, and now we know the whistleblower is coming to Congress tomorrow to testify, and he has some very stark messages to convey to the American people, and also about how he felt he was pushed out, and yet there's concern about some of the scientists where people are getting the best information possible about the virus, what to do, when to open up, all of these things. And there's concern that some of them may or have been sidelined or kneecapped even. So what can Congress do anything to protect these people who are probably our best sources of information during this pandemic? Either one of you.
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes, and the senator has worked on a bipartisan basis over the years to strengthen protections for whistleblowers, particularly in the intelligence community, as he sits on the Senate Intelligence Committee, but also more broadly, he is the co-chair or vice chair of the Senate Whistleblower Caucus with Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. And so they have taken a number of actions over the years to get at this issue of whistleblower retaliation, whether it's, scientists, whether it's folks at the EPA, whether it's people in the military services who blow the whistle and then, face illegal retaliation. So this is definitely a very high priority for the senator, and we have staff members who devote a lot of time to making sure that whistleblower claims are thoroughly and rigorously investigated.
Okay, well, thank you. I think on that note, we're going to wrap up. We appreciate the senator's time and your time, and Lisa Rockauer, I know, is on the call as well. I want to mention, first of all, thanks for everyone who's been listening. Next week, which is March 20th at 4 p.m., we will have the Israeli Deputy Consul General Matan Zamir, who will be speaking about all kinds of issues. A new government in Israel, finally, after three tries, about the Trump plan and other issues of concern. So we hope you'll join us. And thanks again, Jenny, Ben. We appreciate it. And please thank the Senator one more time for all of us. And take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.